The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Copper Creek, Montana, like a shroud over a dying dream. At the weathered kitchen table of the failing Blackwood Ranch, 34-year-old Jake Blackwood stared at the foreclosure notice that had arrived. With the dawn, his calloused hands trembling not from the autumn cold, but from the weight of 4 generations of family legacy slipping through his fingers like sand. In 6 weeks, everything his great-grandfather had built would belong to the bank. But what Jake didn't know was that the solution to his problems was about to walk through his door in the form of a woman he barely knew, carrying secrets that would either save them both or destroy everything they touched. Before we jump back, and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The October wind cut through the gaps in the Blackwood Ranch's barn siding like a knife through butter, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and the bitter taste of impending winter. Jake Blackwood pulled his worn denim jacket tighter around his shoulders as he made his morning rounds, checking on the 18 head of cattle that represented all that remained of what had once been Montana's most prosperous family ranch. His boots crunched through frost-covered hay as he approached the feed troughs, each step echoing the hollow sound of a man walking through the ruins of his own life. The Blackwood Ranch had once sprawled across 12,000 acres of prime Montana grazing land, supporting over 500 head of cattle and employing a dozen ranch hands. Now, Jake worked alone on the remaining 800 acres, struggling to keep even this small remnant afloat. The numbers didn't lie, and Jake had memorized them all through sleepless nights spent hunched over ledgers and bank statements. Mortgage payments 3 months behind, feed costs that exceeded his cattle sales by 40%, equipment breaking down faster than he could afford to repair it. And now, the final blow, the foreclosure notice that gave him exactly 42 days to come up with $127,000 or lose everything. Jake paused at the fence line, watching his breath create small clouds in the frigid air as he surveyed the rolling pastures that had been in his family since 1889. His great-grandfather, Samuel Blackwood, had built this ranch from nothing, arriving from Tennessee with little more than determination and a pregnant wife. By the time Jake's grandfather took over, the Blackwood name was synonymous with quality cattle throughout the region. But prosperity had made Jake's father, Robert Blackwood, complacent. Easy profits in the 1980s and 90s led to over-leveraging, unnecessary expansions, and a failure to adapt to changing market conditions. When the agricultural crisis hit in the early 2000s, followed by the financial collapse of 2008, the ranch's debt load became unsustainable. Robert had spent the last years of his life selling off pieces of the family legacy just to keep the core operation afloat. Jake inherited the ranch at 26, along with debts that would have crushed most men immediately. For 8 years, he had fought tooth and nail to save what remained, taking on additional work as a welder in town, selling off family heirlooms, and living on beans and rice to stretch every dollar. He had no social life, no romantic relationships, and no time for anything, except the endless grind of trying to resurrect something that everyone else considered already dead. The sound of an approaching vehicle broke through Jake's bitter reverie. A dust-covered pickup truck was making its way up the gravel drive, moving slowly, as if the driver was uncertain about their destination. Jake frowned, wondering who would be visiting at 7 in the morning. Most of his creditors preferred to conduct their harassment by phone, and his few remaining neighbors knew better than to drop by unannounced during morning chores. As the truck drew closer, Jake could make out the silhouette of a single occupant, a woman based on the delicate profile visible through the windshield. The vehicle pulled to a stop near the main house, a modest 2-story structure that had seen better decades. Paint peeled from its siding like scabs, and several shutters hung at odd angles, victims of neglect rather than design. The driver's door opened, and Jake felt his breath catch in his throat. The woman who emerged was nothing like he had expected. Tall and graceful, despite her practical clothing, she moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to hard work. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and even from a distance, Jake could see the intelligence in her green eyes as she surveyed the ranch with an appraising gaze. She was beautiful, but not in the polished, artificial way of the women he occasionally encountered in town. This was the kind of beauty that came from strength and purpose, from someone who had faced hardship and emerged stronger rather than broken. Jake estimated she was in her early 30s, though her face carried the wisdom of someone who had lived through more than her years might suggest. The woman spotted Jake near the fence and began walking toward him, her stride purposeful but not aggressive. As she drew closer, Jake could see that her clothes, while practical, were of good quality. Well-fitted jeans, a wool sweater that looked hand-knitted, and boots that had seen honest work but were far from worn out. Everything about her suggested competence and self-sufficiency. "Mr. Blackwood?" she called out when she was still 20 feet away, her voice carrying clearly in the crisp morning air. "I'm Emily Richardson. I believe my attorney contacted you about a meeting." Jake's mind raced, trying to place the name. Then it hit him. Richardson was the name on the letter his lawyer had mentioned 3 weeks ago. Something about a potential business proposition, though the details had been vague, and Jake had been too overwhelmed with immediate crises to pay much attention to what sounded like another dead-end scheme. "Ms. Richardson," Jake replied, removing his work gloves as he approached, "I have to admit I wasn't expecting you quite this early." Emily smiled, and Jake noticed that it reached her eyes in a way that suggested genuine warmth rather than polite courtesy. "I've found that important conversations are best had before the day gets complicated with other obligations. I hope you don't mind the intrusion." "Not at all," Jake said, though he was acutely aware of his appearance. 3 days of stubble, clothes that smelled of hay and cattle, and hands that no amount of scrubbing could completely clean. "Though I should warn you, if this is about some kind of investment opportunity, I'm probably not your target demographic." Emily's laugh was rich and genuine. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm not here to sell you anything. Quite the opposite, actually. I'm here to make you an offer that might solve some of your current financial difficulties." Jake's skepticism must have shown on his face, because Emily quickly continued, "I know how that sounds. Every rancher in Montana has heard variations of that pitch from everyone, from developers to get-rich-quick schemers. But what I'm proposing is different, and frankly, it's going to sound even stranger than a typical business deal." The wind picked up, carrying with it the promise of snow that was still weeks away, but already making itself known in the bite of the air. Jake gestured toward the house. "Why don't we continue this conversation inside? I can put on some coffee, and you can explain what exactly brought you all the way out here." As they walked toward the main house, Emily's eyes took in every detail of the ranch, with the trained gaze of someone who understood agricultural operations. Jake noticed her observing the condition of the fencing, the state of the outbuildings, and the obvious signs of deferred maintenance that came with operating on a shoestring budget. "You've got good bones here," Emily said as they climbed the front porch steps. "The land has excellent natural drainage, and the pasture grasses look healthy despite the dry spell. Your great-grandfather chose his location well." Jake paused, with his hand on the front door. "You know about my great-grandfather?" "I know quite a bit about the Blackwood Ranch, actually. Samuel Blackwood was something of a legend in agricultural circles. His innovations in rotational grazing were ahead of their time, and his bloodline management produced some of the finest cattle in the region for decades." Inside the house, Jake led Emily to the kitchen, a large room that served as the heart of the old ranch house. The appliances were dated but functional, and the massive wooden table that dominated the center of the room had been crafted by Samuel Blackwood himself from trees cleared during the ranch's early development. As Jake busied himself with the coffee maker, Emily took a seat at the table and continued her explanation. "Mr. Blackwood, may I call you Jake? I'm going to be direct with you because I believe honesty is the only foundation for the kind of arrangement I'm proposing." Jake nodded, settling into the chair across from her with 2 steaming mugs. "I appreciate directness. It's been in short supply lately." Emily wrapped her hands around the warm mug, seeming to gather her thoughts before speaking. "I need a husband, and you need money. I'm proposing we solve both problems through a marriage of convenience." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a doused fire. Jake stared at her, certain he had misheard. "I'm sorry, did you just propose marriage to a complete stranger?" "Not a romantic marriage," Emily clarified quickly, though a slight blush colored her cheeks. "A business arrangement, a legal union that would benefit both of us financially and practically without any personal expectations." Jake leaned back in his chair, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. "Miss Richardson, I don't know what kind of research you've done on my situation, but I can assure you that marriage, business or otherwise, isn't going to solve my problems. I'm about 6 weeks away from losing this place entirely." Emily reached into her purse and withdrew a folder, placing it on the table between them. "Actually, it might solve more problems than you realize. But before I explain the financial aspects, let me tell you why I need this arrangement." She opened the folder and slid a document across the table. Jake recognized it as a will, though the legal language was dense and intimidating. "My great-aunt, Margaret Richardson, passed away 6 months ago. She left me an inheritance worth approximately $2.3 million, including a trust fund and several properties in Colorado and Wyoming." Jake's eyes widened. That's a substantial inheritance." "It is," Emily agreed. "But there's a condition. According to the terms of the will, I must be married by my 32nd birthday, which is in exactly 93 days. Or the entire inheritance goes to a distant cousin I've never met, who has already made it clear he intends to sell everything and split the profits with his business partners." The implications began to sink in. "So you need a husband, quickly, to claim an inheritance worth over $2 million. "Exactly. And in return for helping me meet the terms of the will, I'm prepared to offer you enough money to save the Blackwood Ranch and fund its restoration to full operation." Jake felt a surge of hope so sudden and intense, it was almost painful. "How much are we talking about?" Emily consulted another document from her folder. "I'm prepared to pay off your current debts, all $127,000 of them, and provide an additional $300,000 for operational capital and ranch improvements. In exchange, you would marry me within the next 60 days and remain legally married for a minimum of 2 years. The numbers swirled in Jake's head like leaves in a windstorm. Nearly $500,000, enough to not only save the ranch, but to rebuild it into something his great-grandfather would recognize. Enough to restock the cattle herds, repair the equipment, and maybe even hire back some of the ranch hands he'd been forced to let go over the years. "This is insane," Jake said finally. "You don't know anything about me. I could be a serial killer, or a drunk, or completely incompetent at ranching." Emily smiled. "Actually, I know quite a bit about you, Jake Blackwood. I know you've worked 18-hour days for 8 years trying to save a ranch that most people would have walked away from long ago. I know you sold your grandfather's vintage pickup truck, a truck worth $30,000, to pay for veterinary bills when half your herd came down with respiratory infections 3 years ago." Jake stared at her, amazed by the depth of her research. "How do you know all this? I know you've been taking welding jobs in town to supplement your income, even though the work keeps you away from the ranch during critical times. I know you haven't taken a vacation in over a decade, and I know that your neighbors respect you enough to offer help even when they know you're too proud to ask for it." Emily leaned forward, her green eyes intense with conviction. "Most importantly, I know that you're exactly the kind of man my great-aunt would have approved of. Someone who honors his commitments and fights for what he believes in, even when the odds are stacked against him." Jake absorbed this information slowly, trying to separate hope from desperation in his thinking. "Ms. Richardson, Emily, this is incredibly generous, but I have to ask, why me? Surely there are other men who would jump at this opportunity, men who aren't buried in debt and facing foreclosure." Emily was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee as if the answers were hidden in its dark depths. When she looked up, Jake saw something vulnerable in her expression for the first time since she'd arrived. "Because I need someone who won't try to control me or my money," she said quietly. "Someone who understands that this is a business arrangement, not an opportunity to become my keeper. I've spent my adult life building a career as an agricultural consultant, traveling throughout the western states helping ranchers optimize their operations. I'm good at what I do, and I'm not interested in giving up my independence for anyone." She paused, seeming to consider how much to reveal. "I was engaged once to a man who seemed perfect on paper. Successful attorney, came from a good family, said all the right things about supporting my career. But once we started making wedding plans, his true colors showed. He expected me to quit my job, move to Denver, and become the perfect corporate wife who threw dinner parties and looked good at charity functions." Jake could hear the pain and anger in her voice, though she kept her tone carefully controlled. "When I refused to abandon my career, he became increasingly controlling and manipulative. He started undermining my confidence, questioning my judgment, and making me feel like my ambitions were somehow selfish or unrealistic." "What happened?" Jake asked gently. "I finally realized that he didn't want a partner. He wanted a possession, someone he could mold into his vision of what a wife should be. So I ended the engagement, moved away from Colorado, and focused on rebuilding my life on my own terms." Emily straightened in her chair, the vulnerability disappearing behind a mask of professional competence. "That experience taught me that I'm better off alone than with someone who doesn't respect who I am. But this inheritance changes everything. I need to be married to claim it, but I don't want a husband who will try to change me or control my choices." Jake nodded slowly, beginning to understand the complexity of her situation. "So you're looking for someone who needs the money enough to agree to a business arrangement, but who won't try to turn it into something more personal." "Exactly. And based on everything I've learned about you, I believe you're someone I can trust to honor the terms of our agreement without overstepping boundaries or trying to manipulate the situation to your advantage." The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall and the distant sound of cattle moving in the pasture. Jake stared out the window at the land that had defined his family for over a century, weighing an offer that seemed too good to be true against the very real possibility that this might be his only chance to save everything he held dear. "What exactly would this arrangement look like?" he asked finally. "I assume you're not planning to move in here and play house." Emily shook her head. "I would need to establish legal residency here to satisfy the terms of the will. But my work requires extensive travel. I'd probably only be here a few days each month, and when I am here, I'd expect to have my own space and privacy." She gestured around the kitchen. "This house is certainly large enough for two people to coexist without getting in each other's way. We'd be business partners and roommates, nothing more." Jake considered this, trying to imagine what it would be like to share his space with a stranger, even one who seemed as reasonable and straightforward as Emily Richardson. And after 2 years, we'd quietly divorce. I'd have secured my inheritance. You'd have your ranch back on solid footing, and we'd both be free to pursue whatever futures we choose. The offer was extraordinary, almost beyond belief. But as Jake looked at the earnest expression on Emily's face, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than she was telling him. People didn't travel hundreds of miles to propose marriage to strangers unless they were desperate, and Emily Richardson didn't strike him as the desperate type. Still, desperate times called for desperate measures, and Jake was running out of both time and options. In 6 weeks, the bank would foreclose on the Blackwood Ranch, ending 134 years of family history. Emily's offer represented his only realistic chance to prevent that catastrophe. "I need time to think about this," Jake said finally. "It's a big decision, and I don't want to rush into something that could end badly for both of us." Emily nodded, sliding a business card across the table. "Of course, take all the time you need, but remember that we'd need to move quickly if you decide to accept. Marriage licenses, legal paperwork, the logistics of transferring funds, it all takes time." She stood to leave, gathering her folder and purse. "Jake, I want you to know that I wouldn't have made this offer if I didn't believe you were someone I could trust. I've met a lot of people in my line of work, and most of them are decent folks trying to make an honest living in a difficult industry. But you're different. You have the kind of integrity that's become rare in today's world." As she walked toward the door, Emily paused and turned back. "There's one more thing you should know. If you agree to this arrangement, I won't just be your wife on paper. I'll be your partner in every sense that matters. I have ideas about how to modernize this operation, contacts throughout the industry, and experience with agricultural financing that could help you build something even better than what your great-grandfather started." Jake followed her to the porch, watching as she climbed into her pickup truck. Through the windshield, he could see her making notes in a small notebook, probably documenting their conversation with the same methodical approach she seemed to bring to everything else. As the truck disappeared down the gravel drive, leaving only a cloud of dust to mark its passage, Jake stood alone on his porch, staring out at the ranch that might soon belong to someone else. Emily Richardson's offer echoed in his mind, a lifeline thrown to a drowning man who wasn't sure he could trust himself to grab it. The morning mist had burned off, revealing the full extent of the Blackwood Ranch under the pale October sun. Despite its current state of disrepair, the beauty of the land was undeniable. Rolling hills stretched to the horizon, broken by stands of cottonwood and aspen that painted the landscape in shades of gold and crimson. This was the view that had captivated Samuel Blackwood over a century ago, the vision that had inspired him to build a legacy from nothing. Now that legacy hung in the balance, dependent on the decision of a desperate man and the strange proposition of a woman he'd known for less than 2 hours. Jake closed his eyes and tried to imagine what his great-grandfather would advise, but the wind carried no whispers from the past, only the promise of a hard winter and the weight of choices that would define the rest of his life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 3 days after Emily Richardson's unexpected proposal, Jake Blackwood found himself standing in the cramped office of his attorney, Thomas Mitchell, clutching a cup of bitter coffee and trying to make sense of legal documents that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. "Jake, I've been practicing law in this county for 37 years, Tom said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he reviewed the marriage contract Emily's attorney had drafted. "And I can honestly say I've never seen anything quite like this." The law office occupied the second floor of a building that had seen better decades, with creaking wooden floors and windows that rattled when the wind picked up. Tom Mitchell was one of the few attorneys in Copper Creek who understood agricultural law, and he'd been handling the Blackwood family's legal affairs since Jake's father was still alive. "Is it legal?" Jake asked, settling into the worn leather chair across from Tom's desk. "All of it? The marriage contract, the financial arrangements, the inheritance conditions?" Tom nodded slowly, flipping through pages of dense legal text. "It's unusual, but it's all completely legitimate. Ms. Richardson's great-aunt was apparently quite wealthy and very specific about her conditions. The will has been probated in Colorado, and there's no question about its validity." Jake stared. Out the window at Main Street below, where the morning rush consisted of exactly 3 pickup trucks and Mrs. Henderson walking her ancient border collie. Copper Creek wasn't the kind of place where people made life-changing decisions quickly, and the weight of Emily's proposal had been pressing down on him like a physical burden for the past 72 hours. "What's your professional opinion, Tom? Is this woman legitimate, or am I about to walk into some kind of elaborate con game?" Tom removed his glasses and rubbed his tired eyes. "I ran a background check through a colleague in Denver. Emily Richardson is exactly who she says she is. She holds a master's degree in agricultural science from Colorado State. She's been working as an independent consultant for 8 years, and she has an impeccable reputation in the industry." He pulled out another folder from his desk drawer. "I also confirmed the inheritance. Margaret Richardson was indeed her great-aunt. The will is legitimate, and the estate is worth considerably more than the $2.3 million Ms. Richardson mentioned. Her great-aunt owned mining rights, real estate investments, and stock portfolios that have been managed by a trust company for decades." Jake felt a flutter of hope mixed with apprehension. "So she's not lying about the money?" "Definitely not. In fact, she's being conservative in her estimates. But Jake, I have to ask, are you really prepared to marry a woman you barely know, even if it saves the ranch?" It was the question Jake had been asking himself every waking moment since Emily's visit. The practical part of his mind knew that. This was his only realistic option. The bank had made it clear that no extensions would be granted, and every other avenue for raising money had been exhausted years ago. But the deeper question was whether he could live with himself for entering into such a calculated arrangement. Marriage, even a business marriage, carried implications that went beyond simple contracts and financial transactions. "Tom, I've spent 8 years watching everything my family built slowly fall apart," Jake said finally. "I've sold heirlooms, taken second jobs, and lived like a monk just to keep the lights on. In 6 weeks, none of that will matter because the bank will own everything anyway." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains that ringed the valley like sleeping giants. "My great-grandfather came here with nothing and built something that lasted 4 generations. If there's a chance to save that legacy, don't I owe it to him to try?" Tom was quiet for several minutes, considering the implications of what Jake was contemplating. "There are risks here beyond the obvious ones," he said finally. "What happens if this marriage of convenience becomes complicated by real emotions? What if one of you develops feelings for the other? What if the 2-year arrangement becomes permanent?" Jake turned back to face his attorney. Emily was very clear about the boundaries. "This is a business arrangement, nothing more. She has her career, I have the ranch, and after 2 years we'll both be free to pursue whatever futures we want. And you're comfortable with that level of emotional detachment?" The question hit closer to home than Jake cared to admit. He hadn't been in a serious relationship in over 5 years, partly because of the demands of trying to save the ranch, and partly because he'd never met anyone who understood the depth of his commitment to the land. The few women he'd dated had quickly grown tired of competing with cattle and hayfields for his attention. "Tom, I gave up on the idea of a traditional family years ago," Jake said. "The ranch has been my wife, my children, and my future all rolled into one. If I can save it through a business marriage, then that's what I'll do." Tom nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "All right. If you decide to move forward, I'll need to review all the paperwork carefully and make sure your interests are protected. But Jake, I want you to think carefully about what you'll be giving up. 2 years is a long time to live as a married bachelor. That afternoon, Jake drove to the Copper Creek Diner, a fixture on Main Street that had been serving the same menu for 30 years. The lunch crowd consisted of ranchers, bank employees, and the occasional tourist who had gotten lost trying to find Glacier National Park. Jake slid into a corner booth and ordered his usual coffee and a turkey sandwich that came with enough fries to feed a small army. He was halfway through his meal when a familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "Jake Blackwood, you look like a man with the weight of the world on his shoulders." Jake looked up to see Sarah Martinez, the owner of the local feed store, and one of the few people in town who knew the full extent of his financial troubles. Sarah was in her 50s, with graying hair and the kind of practical wisdom that came from running a business in a community where everyone knew everyone else's business. "Mind if I sit?" Sarah asked, already sliding into the booth across from him. "I heard through the grapevine that you might have found a solution to your foreclosure problem." Jake nearly choked on his coffee. "How did you—" "Never mind. I forgot. That news travels faster than wildfire in this town," Sarah smiled. "Tom Mitchell's secretary is my cousin. She mentioned that he'd been doing some unusual legal research involving marriage contracts and inheritance law. Doesn't take a genius to put 2 and 2 together." The waitress brought Sarah a cup of coffee without being asked, a small-town courtesy that Jake had always appreciated. In places like Copper Creek, people looked out for each other, even when times were tough. "So, is it true?" Sarah asked. "Are you really going to marry some stranger to save the ranch?" Jake studied Sarah's face, looking for judgment or disapproval, but found only genuine concern. "I'm considering it. It's not exactly the fairy tale ending most people dream about, but it might be the practical solution I need." Sarah sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "Jake, I've known you since you were 12 years old, and I've watched you sacrifice everything for that ranch. Your social life, your chances at a normal relationship, your health. You've given up more than any one person should have to." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to ensure their conversation remained private. "But here's what I want you to consider. Maybe this arrangement isn't just about saving the ranch. Maybe it's about giving yourself permission to have a different kind of life." Jake frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean that you've been so focused on preserving the past that you've forgotten about building a future. This woman, Emily Richardson, she sounds like someone who could bring fresh perspectives and new opportunities to your operation. Maybe instead of thinking about this as a business transaction, you should consider it as a chance to create something better than what came before." The idea was intriguing, though it challenged Jake's carefully constructed narrative about duty and family legacy. "Sarah, I barely know this woman. How can I build a future with someone who's essentially a stranger? The same way your great-grandfather built a future in a place where he knew nobody and had nothing," Sarah replied. "One day at a time, with hard work and an open mind." She reached across the table and patted Jake's hand with the maternal affection she'd shown him since childhood. Besides, arranged marriages were common throughout history, and many of them developed into partnerships based on mutual respect and shared goals. Maybe what you need isn't romance. Maybe what you need is a true partner who can help you build something lasting. That evening, Jake sat on his front porch with a beer and his grandfather's old ledgers, trying to envision what the ranch could become with proper funding and management. The numbers Emily had proposed were more than adequate to address the immediate crisis, but they also opened up possibilities he'd never allowed himself to consider. With $300,000 in operational capital, he could restock the cattle herds to capacity, repair and upgrade the equipment, and even hire back some of the experienced hands he'd been forced to let go. More importantly, he could implement some of the sustainable ranching practices he'd been reading about, techniques that could improve both profitability and environmental stewardship. As he worked through the calculations, Jake began to see Emily's proposal not just as a rescue from disaster, but as an opportunity to transform the Blackwood Ranch into something his great-grandfather could never have imagined. Modern genetics, rotational grazing systems, direct marketing to restaurants and specialty stores, the possibilities were exciting in a way that purely survival-focused ranching had never been. His cell phone rang, interrupting his planning session. The caller ID showed Emily Richardson's number, and Jake felt his pulse quicken as he answered. "Jake, I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." Emily's voice was clear despite the distance between them. "I wanted to check in and see if you'd had time to consider my proposal." "I've been thinking about little else," Jake admitted. "I've had my attorney review the contracts and everything appears to be legitimate and fair, but I have some questions about the practical aspects of our arrangement." "Of course. I'd be surprised if you didn't." Jake took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts. "First, you mentioned that you'd need to establish legal residency here. What exactly does that mean in terms of your living situation?" "I'd need to maintain a physical address at the ranch and spend at least part of my time there," Emily explained. "But as I mentioned, my work requires extensive travel. I'd probably be there 10 to 15 days per month, sometimes more during slow periods, sometimes less during busy seasons. And when you are here, you'd want your own space." "Ideally, yes. I'm used to living independently, and I think we'd both be more comfortable with clear boundaries." "Does the house have multiple bedrooms?" Jake looked through the front door at the spacious interior of the ranch house. 5 bedrooms upstairs, plus the master suite on the main floor. You could have an entire wing to yourself if you wanted. "That sounds perfect. I'm not a demanding house guest. I clean up after myself, I'm quiet, and I generally keep to my own schedule. I think we could coexist quite comfortably." Jake appreciated her directness, though he found himself curious about the woman behind the businesslike demeanor. "Emily, can I ask you something personal, within reason? Why ranching? You could use your inheritance to do anything, travel the world, start any kind of business, live anywhere you wanted. Why choose to tie yourself to agricultural consulting and life in rural Montana?" Emily was quiet for so long that Jake wondered if the call had dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a warmth that he hadn't heard before. "My grandfather was a rancher in eastern Colorado," she said. "Small operation, nothing fancy, but he loved the land and the animals with a passion that was infectious. I spent summers with him as a child, and those were the happiest times of my life." She paused, and Jake could hear the faint sound of wind through her phone, as if she were standing outside somewhere. "When I was in college, my grandfather got sick and had to sell the ranch to pay for medical bills. He died 6 months later, and I always felt like he died of a broken heart as much as cancer. I went into agricultural consulting because I wanted to help other ranchers avoid his fate." The revelation added depth to Emily's character that intrigued Jake. "So this isn't just about the inheritance for you, it's about preserving a way of life." "Exactly. And Jake, I've researched your family's history extensively. The Blackwood Ranch represents exactly the kind of agricultural legacy that needs to be preserved and modernized for future generations. I'm not just offering you money, I'm offering you a partner who understands what this land means and who has the knowledge to help you build something sustainable." Jake felt something shift in his understanding of their arrangement. This wasn't just a desperate woman buying a husband to claim an inheritance. This was a professional who saw an opportunity to create something meaningful while solving both of their problems. "Emily, there's something I need to know. Are you prepared for the realities of ranch life? The early mornings, the physical demands, the isolation, The fact that everything revolves around the weather and the animals, Emily laughed, and the sound was genuine and appealing. Jake, I've been working with ranchers for 8 years. I've spent nights in lambing sheds, helped with difficult carving, and mucked out more stalls than I can count. I may not have grown up on a ranch, but I've learned to love the life through my work. As their conversation continued, Jake found himself increasingly impressed by Emily's knowledge and genuine enthusiasm for agricultural life. She asked intelligent questions about his current operation, offered suggestions for improvements, and demonstrated an understanding of ranching that went far beyond textbook knowledge. By the time they ended the call an hour later, Jake had made his decision. The arrangement Emily proposed offered him more than just financial salvation. It offered him a chance to build the kind of operation he'd always dreamed of, with a partner who shared his values and understood his goals. The next morning, Jake called Tom Mitchell's office and scheduled an appointment to finalize the paperwork. Then he called Emily and accepted her proposal, setting in motion a chain of events that would transform both of their lives in ways neither of them could anticipate. As he hung up the phone, Jake looked out at the rolling pastures of the Blackwood Ranch and tried to imagine what they would look like a year from now, when proper management and adequate funding had restored them to their full potential. For the first time in years, the future looked bright with possibility, rather than dark with impending loss. What Jake didn't know was that Emily Richardson had her own secrets, her own reasons for choosing him specifically, and her own hopes for what their unusual partnership might become. The business arrangement they were entering into would test both of their assumptions about love, partnership, and the meaning of family in ways that would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves. The Copper Creek Courthouse at 9 o'clock on a crisp November morning was not where Jake Blackwood had ever imagined getting married. The utilitarian building with its beige walls and fluorescent lighting seemed more suited to paying parking tickets than exchanging vows. Yet here he stood, wearing his only suit, a navy blue number he'd purchased for his father's funeral 8 years ago, waiting for a woman he'd known for exactly 3 weeks to become his wife. Judge Patricia Holbrook, a stern woman in her 60s, who had been presiding over the county's legal affairs for 2 decades, reviewed the marriage license with the thoroughness of someone who had seen every possible variation of human folly. Beside her stood the required witness, Tom Mitchell, who looked as uncomfortable as Jake felt about the entire proceeding. "This is highly irregular," Judge Holbrook muttered, adjusting her reading glasses as she examined the prenuptial agreement that accompanied their marriage license. "In 40 years of conducting ceremonies, I've never seen a contract this detailed for what's supposed to be a union of hearts." Jake shifted nervously, glancing at his watch. Emily was 10 minutes late, and with each passing moment he wondered if she had changed her mind. The financial arrangements had been finalized the previous week, his debts cleared, the foreclosure cancelled, and operational funds already transferred to the ranch's accounts. Legally, Emily could disappear now and leave him with the money, though their contract specified severe penalties for breach of agreement. The courthouse door opened with a bang that echoed through the small building. Emily Richardson, soon to be Emily Blackwood, hurried inside, her cheeks flushed from the cold, and her auburn hair slightly disheveled from what appeared to have been a frantic morning. She wore a simple cream-colored dress that was elegant, without being overly formal, and Jake noticed that she carried a small bouquet of wildflowers that looked hastily gathered. "I'm so sorry," Emily said breathlessly, approaching the small group assembled before Judge Holbrook's bench. "My flight from Denver was delayed, and then my rental car wouldn't start at the airport in Billings. I drove straight here from the rental agency." Jake felt an unexpected wave of relief at her arrival, followed immediately by curiosity about where she had been and why she had cut their wedding day so close. "I was starting to worry you'd had second thoughts," he said, attempting a smile. Emily met his eyes directly, and Jake saw determination there rather than the nervousness he had expected. "No second thoughts. This is the right decision for both of us." Judge Holbrook cleared her throat impatiently. "If we're all ready to proceed, let's get this done. I have a full docket this morning." The ceremony itself lasted exactly 7 minutes. There were no romantic declarations, no emotional moments, and no kiss to seal their union, just the efficient exchange of legal vows that transformed two strangers into husband and wife in the eyes of the law. When Judge Holbrook pronounced them married, Jake and Emily shook hands with the same formality they might have used to conclude a business meeting. As they signed the marriage certificate, Emily leaned close enough that Jake caught a hint of her perfume, something light and floral that seemed incongruous with their sterile surroundings. "There's something I need to tell you," she whispered. "Something that couldn't wait until we got to the ranch." Jake's pen paused over the document. "What kind of something?" "The kind that might complicate our arrangement considerably." Before Jake could respond, Tom Mitchell approached with copies of their paperwork and congratulations that sounded forced, even by his diplomatic standards. "Well, that's done. Mrs. Blackwood, do you need directions to the ranch?" "Actually," Emily said, glancing meaningfully at Jake, "I was hoping my husband could show me the way. We have some things to discuss." 20 minutes later, Jake and Emily sat in his pickup truck in the courthouse parking lot while snow began to fall in lazy flakes that dusted the windshield. Emily had declined his offer to follow her to the ranch in her rental car, insisting, instead, that they travel together. Now she seemed to be gathering courage for whatever revelation she needed to share. "Jake, I haven't been entirely honest with you about my situation," Emily began, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "The inheritance is real, the marriage requirement is real, but there are complications I didn't mention." Jake felt his stomach tighten with apprehension. "What kind of complications?" Emily took a deep breath. "My cousin, Richard Richardson, the one who stands to inherit if I don't meet the marriage deadline. He's not just a distant relative I've never met. He's someone who's been actively working to prevent me from claiming the inheritance." She reached into her purse and withdrew a manila folder. 3 weeks ago, he filed a legal challenge, claiming that my great-aunt was mentally incompetent when she wrote her will. He's also been spreading rumors in Colorado about my professional competence, trying to damage my reputation and my business relationships. Jake examined the legal documents she handed him, though the dense legalese was difficult to follow. Can he actually succeed in overturning the will? Probably not, but he can tie it up in court for years and make the process so expensive that I'd have to give up even if I technically have the stronger case. That's why I left Colorado so suddenly. His lawyers have been serving subpoenas and demanding depositions that are designed more to harass than to gather information. The implications began to sink in. "Emily, are you telling me that by marrying you I've made myself a target for this guy's legal campaign?" "It's possible," Emily admitted. "Richard has significant resources, and he's already demonstrated that he's willing to use them aggressively. I should have told you about this before we got married, but I was afraid you'd change your mind." Jake stared through the windshield at the falling snow, processing this new information. In the span of one morning, he had gone from desperate rancher to married man to potential defendant in a family inheritance dispute. "What exactly does this mean for our arrangement?" Emily's voice became more confident, as if she had rehearsed this explanation. "It means we need to be prepared for scrutiny. Richard's attorneys will probably investigate our marriage, looking for evidence that it's a sham designed solely to help me claim the inheritance. They'll want to prove that we're not a legitimate couple." "But we're not a legitimate couple," Jake pointed out. This is exactly the kind of arrangement they're looking for. That's why we need to be very careful about how we present ourselves. We need to appear to be a real married couple who fell in love and decided to build a life together. Any evidence that this is purely a business transaction could give Richard the ammunition he needs to challenge the inheritance. Jake rubbed his temples, feeling the beginning of a headache. Emily, I agreed to a business marriage, not a performance designed to fool investigators and attorneys. What you're talking about sounds like fraud. It's not fraud if we actually live as husband and wife, Emily said quietly. Jake, I know this isn't what we originally discussed, but maybe this situation is forcing us to consider possibilities we hadn't thought about. The suggestion hung in the air between them like smoke. From a doused fire, Jake studied Emily's profile as she stared out the passenger window, noting the determined set of her jaw and the way her hands had steadied as she spoke about their options. Are you suggesting that we try to make this a real marriage? Jake asked. Emily turned to face him, and Jake saw something vulnerable in her green eyes. I'm suggesting that we give ourselves permission to see where this leads. We're attracted to each other. I can feel it, and I think you can too. We have compatible goals and values. Maybe instead of fighting against the situation, we should embrace it. Jake felt his pulse quicken at her words. She was right about the attraction. He had been aware of it since their first meeting, though he had pushed those feelings aside in favor of focusing on the practical aspects of their arrangement. Emily, what happens if we try to make this real and it doesn't work? What happens to the ranch, to your inheritance, to everything we've both invested in this arrangement? Then we deal with those problems when we come to them, Emily replied. But Jake, what if it does work? What if we discover that this crazy arrangement is actually the beginning of something wonderful? Before Jake could respond, his cell phone rang. The caller ID showed Sarah Martinez from the feed store, and Jake answered with a sense of foreboding. Jake, thank God I reached you. Sarah's voice was tight with urgency. There are 2 men at your ranch asking questions about you and your new wife. They're claiming to be insurance investigators, but they're asking the kind of questions that have nothing to do with insurance. Jake met Emily's eyes and saw his own concern reflected there. What kind of questions? Questions about how long you've known Emily, whether you've been seen together around town, whether this marriage seems genuine. Jake, these men are clearly working for someone who wants to cause trouble for you. Emily leaned close to the phone so she could hear Sarah's end of the conversation. Did they show any identification? They had business cards from some investigation firm in Denver, Sarah replied. But Jake, they were also taking pictures of the ranch buildings and asking about your financial situation. This doesn't feel legitimate. Jake started the truck's engine. Sarah, don't tell them anything else. If they come back, call Sheriff Davidson immediately. As they drove toward the ranch, Emily sat in thoughtful silence, occasionally giving Jake directions to take back roads that would allow them to approach the property without being seen from the main driveway. Her knowledge of the area surprised him until he remembered that she had been researching his situation for weeks before making her proposal. There's a service road that runs along the back of your property, Emily said, as they turned onto a gravel path that Jake had forgotten existed. We can park there and walk through the pasture to see if these investigators are still around. 20 minutes later, they crouched behind a stand of cottonwood trees at the edge of Jake's property, watching 2 men in expensive suits examine the exterior of his barn with professional cameras. Even from a distance, it was clear that these were not insurance investigators conducting a routine inquiry. They're documenting everything, Emily whispered. The condition of the buildings, the equipment, probably trying to establish how much money it would have taken to improve the operation. Jake watched the men work with growing anger. They're looking for evidence that you paid for ranch improvements before our marriage, aren't they? Trying to prove that our relationship predates what we've claimed. Exactly. Richard's attorneys are thorough, and they're not above using questionable tactics to gather information. One of the investigators approached the front door of the ranch, Hodges, and knocked loudly. When no one answered, he tried the door handle and then walked around the building, peering through windows and taking notes on a clipboard. "That's definitely illegal," Jake said, pulling out his cell phone. "I'm calling the sheriff." Emily placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Wait, let's see what else they do. If we can document their illegal activities, it might help our case." If this goes to court, for the next hour, they watched the investigators conduct what amounted to a warrantless search of Jake's property. The men examined his equipment, photographed his cattle, and even went through his mailbox, looking for correspondence that might reveal the timeline of his relationship with Emily. Finally, the investigators climbed into their black sedan and drove away, leaving Jake and Emily to emerge from their hiding spot and survey the violation of his privacy. "Welcome to married life," Emily said with bitter humor as they walked toward the house. "I'm sorry, Jake. I should have warned you that Richard would move this quickly." Jake unlocked the front door and held it open for his new wife. "Emily, we need to establish some ground rules for how we're going to handle this situation. I won't live in fear of investigators and attorneys, but I also won't participate in anything that's actually illegal." Inside the house, Emily set her small suitcase down in the entryway and looked around with the appraising gaze Jake had noticed during her first visit. "This is beautiful, Jake. Your great-grandfather built something that was meant to last." The compliment helped ease some of the tension from their morning of revelations and surveillance. "The house has been in the family since 1923. My great-grandmother insisted on indoor plumbing and electricity, which was pretty progressive for a ranch house at the time." Emily walked through the rooms with obvious appreciation for the craftsmanship and history embedded in every piece of woodwork and every carefully chosen detail. "Jake, I want you to know that whatever happens with Richard's legal challenges, I'm committed to helping you preserve this legacy. That's not just talk, that's a promise." As the afternoon wore on, they developed a plan for presenting their marriage as genuine while protecting themselves legally. They would share the master bedroom to maintain appearances, though Emily would sleep in the guest room when they had genuine privacy. They would be seen together in town, attend community events as a couple, and gradually build a public history of their relationship. "It won't be easy," Emily warned, as they prepared dinner together in the spacious ranch kitchen. "Richard's investigators will be looking for any sign that we're acting like roommates rather than newlyweds." Jake found himself watching Emily as she moved confidently around his kitchen, noting how naturally she seemed to fit into the domestic routines of ranch life. "Emily, can I ask you something personal? After everything we've discussed today, I think we're beyond worrying about personal boundaries. Why did you really choose me for this arrangement? I know you said you researched my background, but there had to be other ranchers in similar situations who could have used your help." Emily paused in her dinner preparations, a wooden spoon suspended halfway to her mouth for tasting. "Honestly, because when I researched your family's history, I found stories about your great-grandfather that reminded me of my own grandfather. The way he treated his land, his animals, his community, there was an integrity there that's become rare." She set down the spoon and turned to face Jake directly. "But there was something else. When I drove onto this property for the first time, I felt like I was coming home. I've traveled all over the West, visited hundreds of ranches, but I'd never experienced that feeling before." The admission created an intimacy between them that neither had anticipated when they began their practical arrangement. As they sat down to their first dinner as husband and wife, Jake found himself wondering if Emily's cousin's legal challenges might actually be a blessing in disguise, forcing them to explore possibilities that they might never have considered. Otherwise, Outside, the November snow continued to fall, blanketing the Blackwood Ranch in pristine white and creating the kind of peaceful evening that Jake had always associated with home. For the first time in years, he wasn't eating dinner alone, and despite the complications that marriage had brought into his life, he discovered that he was genuinely glad for Emily's company. What neither of them realized was that their investigators had planted listening devices during their illegal search, and that every word of their conversation was being recorded and transmitted to attorneys in Denver who were building a case to destroy everything they hoped to build together. The piercing shriek of the smoke alarm jolted Jake from sleep at 4:47 a.m. He bolted upright in the master bedroom, his heart hammering as the acrid smell of burning electronics filled his nostrils. Through the darkness, he could see Emily already on her feet, pulling on a robe over the oversized t-shirt she'd worn to bed in the guest room before joining him in the master bedroom for appearances. "That's not a fire," Emily said, her voice sharp with alarm as she sniffed the air. "That's electrical burning. Something's overheating." Jake grabbed his jeans from the chair beside the bed, pulling them on as he moved toward the bedroom door. "The main electrical panel is in the basement. Could be a short circuit or—" He stopped mid-sentence as a chilling realization hit him. "Emily, yesterday those investigators were examining the outside of the house very carefully. What if they didn't just plant listening devices?" Emily's face went pale in the dim light filtering through the bedroom windows. "You think they sabotaged something?" Before Jake could respond, the lights flickered and went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. Emergency lighting from the smoke detectors provided the only illumination as they made their way carefully down the stairs, using the flashlight app on Jake's phone to navigate. In the basement, Jake's worst fears were confirmed. The main electrical panel showed clear signs of tampering. Wires that had been loosened, connections that appeared to have been deliberately compromised. Scorch marks around one of the main breakers indicated where the overheating had begun. "This is sabotage," Jake said grimly, examining the damaged components with his flashlight. "Someone wanted to create a dangerous situation, maybe hoping we'd have a fire or at least significant property damage." Emily crouched beside him, studying the electrical panel with surprising knowledge. "Jake, this is more than just harassment. This is attempted arson. If we hadn't woken up when we did, if the smoke detectors hadn't worked properly..." The implications hung heavy in the basement air. Jake pulled out his cell phone and dialed 911, requesting both the fire department and Sheriff Davidson. As they waited for emergency responders, Emily made a disturbing discovery near the basement stairs. "Jake, look at this." She was examining a small electronic device that had been crudely attached to the underside of the staircase. "This isn't just a listening device. This has a camera lens and what looks like a wireless transmitter." Jake examined the device with growing anger. "They've been watching us. Every move we've made in this house, every conversation, every moment we thought was private." Emily's face flushed with rage and violation. "That means they have footage of us discussing our arrangement, our strategy for appearing like a real couple, everything we said about Richard's legal challenges." 20 minutes later, the Blackwood Ranch was swarming with emergency personnel. Fire Chief Marcus Sullivan, no relation to Sarah Martinez but equally invested in the community's welfare, examined the electrical damage, while Sheriff Davidson documented the surveillance equipment Emily had discovered. "Jake, this is way beyond a simple domestic dispute," Sheriff Davidson said as he photographed the tampered electrical panel. "Someone committed multiple felonies here: breaking and entering, destruction of property, illegal surveillance, and potentially attempted arson." Sheriff Davidson was a man in his 50s who had been keeping the peace in Copper Creek County for over 20 years. He knew every family, every long-standing feud, and every pattern of trouble that emerged in rural communities. This level of sophisticated criminal activity was unprecedented in his experience. "The question is, can we prove who's responsible?" Jake asked, though he already suspected the answer. "The surveillance equipment is high-end, military-grade," Sheriff Davidson replied. "This isn't something you buy at an electronics store. Whoever planted it has serious resources and professional connections." Emily wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking vulnerable, despite her usual confident demeanor. "Sheriff, there's something you need to know about why someone might be targeting us." Over the next hour, Emily explained the inheritance situation, Richard Richardson's legal challenges, and the investigators who had been documenting their property the previous day. Sheriff Davidson listened with growing concern, taking detailed notes and asking questions that revealed his understanding of the complexity they were facing. "Mrs. Blackwood," Sheriff Davidson said, and Jake noticed Emily's slight start at hearing her new married name. "What you're describing sounds like a coordinated campaign of harassment and intimidation. The problem is, these people are probably operating from out of state, which makes jurisdiction complicated." Fire Chief Sullivan approached their group with his preliminary assessment. The electrical damage was definitely deliberate, and whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing. A few more minutes, and you would have had a serious house fire that could have spread to the outbuildings. Jake felt a cold fury settling in his chest. They were willing to destroy everything, the house, the barn, potentially kill us, just to prevent Emily from claiming her inheritance. "It gets worse," Sheriff Davidson said, consulting his notebook. "I ran the license plate on that sedan the investigators were driving yesterday. It's registered to a shell company in Delaware that's owned by another shell company in Nevada. These people have covered their tracks professionally." As the emergency responders finished their work and began to leave, Jake and Emily found themselves alone in their violated home, trying to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. The electrical system was temporarily repaired enough to restore power, but the sense of safety and privacy had been shattered completely. "Emily, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me," Jake said, as they sat at the kitchen table with cups of coffee that neither of them was actually drinking. "Is there anything else about this inheritance situation that you haven't told me? Any other dangers or complications I should know about?" Emily was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee as if it contained answers to questions she hadn't wanted to face. "There's one more thing," she said finally. "The inheritance isn't just money and property. It includes controlling interest in Richardson Mining Corporation, a company that's been extracting coal and copper from federal lands in Colorado for over 60 years. Jake felt his stomach drop. "How much are we talking about?" "The mining rights alone are worth approximately $50 million. But there's more. Those contracts are up for renewal next year, and there are environmental groups and government agencies trying to prevent the renewals. If Richard gets control of the company, he's planning to sell the mining rights to a conglomerate that specializes in strip mining." The scope of the situation began to crystallize for Jake. So this isn't just about a family inheritance. This is about tens of millions of dollars and environmental destruction. "Exactly. My great-aunt Margaret was an environmentalist who wanted to transition the company away from mining toward renewable energy development. That's part of why she structured the inheritance the way she did. She wanted someone who would honor her environmental values rather than just maximize short-term profits." Emily stood and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the snow-covered pastures where Jake's cattle grazed peacefully. "Jake, I should have told you about the mining company from the beginning. I know this changes everything, and if you want to dissolve our marriage and walk away, I'll understand." Jake studied Emily's profile as she stood silhouetted against the window, noting the tension in her shoulders and the way her hands gripped the coffee mug like a lifeline. The woman who had walked into his life 3 weeks ago with a straightforward business proposition had become someone far more complex and interesting and far more dangerous to know. Emily, turn around and look at me. She turned, and Jake saw fear in her green eyes for the first time since he'd known her. Not fear of physical danger, but fear of abandonment, fear that she had finally revealed something that would drive him away. "I'm not walking away," Jake said firmly. "These people tried to burn down my family's ranch and potentially kill us both. That makes this personal in a way that has nothing to do with business arrangements or inheritance disputes." Relief flooded Emily's features, followed quickly by something that looked like gratitude mixed with affection. "Jake, you don't understand what you're signing up for. Richard has connections to mining interests, political figures, and enforcement agencies that I'm only beginning to discover. He's not going to stop with electrical sabotage." "Then we need to be smarter and more prepared than he is," Jake replied. "Emily, I've spent 8 years fighting to save this ranch against impossible odds. I'm not about to give up now because some entitled rich boy wants to play dirty." As if summoned by their conversation, Jake's cell phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number with a Colorado area code. Jake answered with a sense of foreboding. "Mr. Blackwood, this is Richard Richardson." The voice was smooth, educated, and carried an undertone of barely concealed arrogance. "I believe you recently married my cousin Emily." Jake met Emily's eyes and saw his own surprise reflected there. "Yes, I did. What can I do for you, Mr. Richardson?" "I'm calling to offer you an opportunity to reconsider your recent decision. I understand that Emily has made you certain financial promises in exchange for this marriage, but I'm prepared to offer you considerably more to annul the union and walk away." The audacity of the offer stunned Jake momentarily. "Mr. Richardson, I'm not sure what you think you know about my marriage, but, Mr. Blackwood, let's not waste time with pretense. I know exactly what kind of arrangement you and Emily have entered into. I also know that the events of this morning have given you a preview of what to expect if you continue down this path." Jake's grip tightened on the phone. "Are you confessing to the sabotage at my ranch?" Richard's laugh was cold and humorless. "I'm simply observing that unfortunate accidents seem to happen around people who interfere with my business interests. I'm offering you a way to avoid future complications." Emily gestured frantically for Jake to put the call on speaker. He complied, allowing her to hear Richard's threats directly. "What exactly are you offering?" Jake asked, though he had no intention of accepting any deal. $5 million cash, transferred to any account you specify. In exchange, you file for annulment on grounds of fraud, and you publicly state that Emily misrepresented the nature of your relationship. You keep the money you've already received from her, plus my bonus, and you never see or communicate with my cousin again." Emily's face had gone white with rage, but she gestured for Jake to keep Richard talking. "That's a generous offer," Jake said carefully. "But I'm curious, why is it so important to you that Emily not claim her inheritance? Surely there's enough money involved for both of you to live comfortably." "Mr. Blackwood, this isn't about money. It's about preventing Emily from making decisions that would damage important business relationships and environmental contracts that have been decades in the making. My cousin is an idealistic fool who doesn't understand the economic realities of resource extraction." Richard's tone became more aggressive. "She would rather preserve habitat for spotted owls than provide jobs for working families. She would rather pursue expensive renewable energy fantasies than honor existing contracts that support entire communities." Emily grabbed a piece of paper and wrote quickly, "He's lying. Those contracts support very few jobs but generate huge profits for shareholders." "Mr. Richardson," Jake said, "I appreciate your offer, but I'm not interested in annulling my marriage. Emily and I are building a life together, and we're prepared to face whatever challenges that brings." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Jake wondered if Richard had hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a menace that sent chills down Jake's spine. Mr. Blackwood, you're making a very serious mistake. Emily has undoubtedly told you that this is about family disagreements and inheritance law. What she hasn't told you is that there are federal investigations into some of her consulting work, questions about her recommendations that have cost mining companies millions of dollars in lost revenue. Jake met Emily's eyes and saw shock there. This was apparently news to her as well. The FBI is very interested in patterns of consulting advice that seem designed to damage American energy independence, Richard continued. It would be unfortunate if your association with Emily brought you under that same scrutiny. Richard's threat was clear: cooperate or face federal investigation on potentially fabricated charges. Jake felt his anger crystallizing into something harder and more dangerous. Mr. Richardson, I think our conversation is finished. If you want to communicate with my wife or me in the future, you can do it through our attorneys. Your wife, Richard repeated, and Jake could hear the sneer in his voice. Mr. Blackwood, by this time next week, you'll wish you had taken my offer. Emily has a talent for destroying everything she touches, and you're about to discover that firsthand. The line went dead, leaving Jake and Emily staring at each other across the kitchen table, both of them processing the implications of Richard's threats and revelations. Emily, Jake said quietly, is there any truth to what he said about federal investigations? Emily's voice was steady, but Jake could see the strain in her face. Absolutely not. My consulting work has always been based on legitimate environmental science and sustainable agriculture practices. But Jake, Richard has enough money and political connections to manufacture investigations, to create problems that look real, even when they're not. As the morning sun climbed higher over the Blackwood Ranch, illuminating the snow-covered landscape in brilliant white light, Jake and Emily began to understand that their marriage of convenience had become something far more complex and dangerous than either of them had anticipated. They were no longer just fighting for an inheritance or a ranch. They were fighting for their freedom, their reputations, and possibly their lives. But as Jake looked at Emily sitting across from him, her green eyes blazing with determination, despite the fear he knew she was feeling, he realized that somewhere in the midst of all the chaos and danger, something unexpected had begun to grow between them, something that made the fight worthwhile, regardless of the odds they were facing. The battle for Emily's inheritance was about to become a war, and Jake Blackwood was discovering that he was prepared to fight it, not just as Emily's business partner, but as her husband in every sense that mattered. The morning after Richard Richardson's threatening phone call, Jake stood in his rebuilt barn, watching Emily work with his most difficult horse, a temperamental quarter-horse stallion named Thunder, who had never let anyone except Jake handle him. Yet here was Emily, moving with quiet confidence as she adjusted Thunder's halter, speaking to the animal in low, soothing tones that seemed to calm his usual aggressiveness. "Where did you learn to do that?" Jake asked, genuinely impressed as Thunder nuzzled Emily's shoulder with unusual gentleness. Emily smiled, the first genuine smile Jake had seen from her since discovering the surveillance equipment. "My grandfather taught me that horses can sense fear, anger, and deception better than most humans. They respond to authenticity." She paused, stroking Thunder's neck. "Maybe that's something we should remember as we deal with Richard's threats." Before Jake could respond, the sound of approaching vehicles interrupted their quiet moment. Through the barn doors, they could see a convoy of 3 black SUVs turning up the ranch's gravel driveway, moving with the kind of purposeful coordination that suggested official business. "More investigators?" Emily asked, her hand instinctively moving toward her cell phone. "No," Jake said grimly, recognizing the lead vehicle. "That's FBI agent Catherine Morrison's car. I know because she grew up here in Copper Creek. Her father owns the hardware store in town." Emily's face went pale. "Jake, Richard wasn't bluffing about federal investigations. They're here because of what he said on the phone yesterday." The FBI agents exited their vehicles with professional efficiency, but Jake noticed that Agent Morrison separated herself from the group and approached alone while her colleagues remained by their cars. Catherine Morrison was a woman in her 40s who had returned to Montana after a distinguished career with the Bureau's white-collar crime division. "Jake Blackwood," Agent Morrison called out as she approached the barn. "I need to speak with you and your wife about some serious allegations that have been brought to our attention." Jake stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Emily in a protective gesture that he hadn't consciously planned. "Agent Morrison, good to see you again. What kind of allegations are we talking about?" Agent Morrison's expression was professionally neutral, but Jake caught a hint of something that might have been sympathy in her eyes. "Jake, we've received information suggesting that your recent marriage might be connected to a conspiracy to defraud federal agencies and manipulate environmental assessments for financial gain." Emily stepped out from behind Jake, her chin raised with defiance. "Agent Morrison, I'm Emily Richardson Blackwood. I assume these allegations come from my cousin, Richard Richardson, who stands to lose millions of dollars if I successfully claim my inheritance. Mrs. Blackwood, the source of our information is confidential, but I can tell you that we have documentation suggesting systematic irregularities in environmental consulting reports you've submitted over the past 3 years." Agent Morrison reached into her briefcase and withdrew a manila folder. "Reports that consistently overestimated environmental damage from proposed mining operations, leading to permit denials that cost companies hundreds of millions in lost revenue." Jake felt his anger rising. "Agent Morrison, with respect, isn't it an environmental consultant's job to accurately assess potential damage? If Emily's reports led to permit denials, maybe that's because the proposed operations would have caused genuine environmental harm. That's certainly one interpretation," Agent Morrison replied carefully. "But when those reports are consistently more pessimistic than assessments from other qualified consultants, and when the person submitting them stands to benefit financially from mining permit denials, it raises questions about potential conflicts of interest." Emily's voice was steady, despite the severity of the accusations. "Agent Morrison, I'd like to see the specific documentation you're referring to. I've maintained detailed records of all my consulting work, including the scientific methodology and peer reviews that support my conclusions. We'll be requesting those records as part of our investigation," Agent Morrison said. "But first, I need to ask you both some questions about the timing and nature of your marriage." For the next hour, Jake and Emily answered questions that made it clear the FBI had been provided with detailed information about their arrangement. Agent Morrison knew about the foreclosure threats, the timeline of Emily's inheritance deadline, and even details about their first meeting that could only have come from surveillance recordings. "Mrs. Blackwood," Agent Morrison said as the interview neared its conclusion, "I need to ask you directly. Is your marriage to Mr. Blackwood a genuine romantic union? Or is it a business arrangement designed to help you meet the terms of your inheritance?" Emily met the agent's gaze directly. "Agent Morrison, my marriage to Jake is legally valid and personally meaningful. How we came to be married is our private business, not a matter for federal investigation." Agent Morrison closed her notebook and stood to leave. "Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood, I want to be clear about something. This investigation is preliminary and no charges have been filed. However, I strongly recommend that you obtain qualified legal representation immediately." As the FBI convoy departed, Jake and Emily stood in their driveway feeling like survivors of a natural disaster. The morning that had begun with hope and quiet moments had become another chapter in what was rapidly escalating into a full-scale legal war. "Emily, we need help," Jake said as they walked back toward the house. "Professional help from people who understand how to fight this kind of battle." Emily nodded, but before she could respond, Jake's cell phone rang. The caller ID showed Tom. Mitchell, his attorney, and Jake answered with a sense of dread. "Jake, thank God I reached you." Tom's voice was tight with urgency. "I just got off the phone with a colleague in Denver who specializes in federal white-collar defense. We need to talk immediately, and we need to bring in additional legal support." An hour later, Jake and Emily sat in Tom Mitchell's office, listening to the most sobering legal assessment either of them had ever heard. Tom had been joined by Rebecca Chen, a federal defense attorney from Billings who specialized in environmental law and government investigations. "The situation is more serious than any of us initially realized," Rebecca Chen said, reviewing the files Tom had assembled. "Richard Richardson has apparently been building this case against Emily for months, possibly years. He's provided the FBI with what appears to be a comprehensive dossier of allegedly suspicious activities." Tom leaned forward in his chair. "Rebecca, what exactly are we looking at in terms of potential charges? Worst-case scenario, conspiracy to defraud the federal government, mail fraud, wire fraud, and potentially violations of environmental protection laws. If convicted on all counts, Emily could be looking at 20 to 30 years in federal prison." The room fell silent as the magnitude of their situation sank in. Emily's face had gone ashen, but her voice remained steady when she spoke. "Ms. Chen, I need you to understand something. Every environmental assessment I've ever submitted has been based on legitimate scientific analysis. I have documentation, peer reviews, and independent verification for every conclusion I've reached." Rebecca Chen nodded. "Mrs. Blackwood, I believe you. But the problem is that Richard Richardson has apparently found other consultants who reached different conclusions about the same sites. The FBI is being told that your consistently more cautious assessments represent a pattern of deliberate obstruction." Jake had been listening to this legal discussion with growing frustration. "Ms. Chen, it sounds like you're saying that Emily is being prosecuted for being better at her job than other consultants. In essence, yes. Environmental consulting often involves subjective judgment calls, and different experts can legitimately reach different conclusions. But when someone has financial motivations to reach particular conclusions, it becomes a federal matter." Tom Mitchell pulled out another folder. "There's something else we need to discuss. Jake, the FBI has also requested your financial records for the past 5 years. They're looking for evidence that you and Emily had a financial relationship before your recent marriage." Jake felt his stomach drop. "They're trying to prove that our relationship predates what we've claimed." "Exactly. And if they can establish that you've been in communication or had financial dealings before Emily's inheritance deadline approached, it strengthens their case that this marriage is fraudulent." Rebecca Chen consulted her notes. "The good news is that environmental law is complex, and federal prosecutors are often reluctant to bring cases unless they're certain of conviction. The bad news is that Richard Richardson appears to have significant political connections who might be pressuring for aggressive prosecution." As the legal consultation continued, Emily asked the question that had been weighing on all of their minds. "What can we do to fight back?" Rebecca Chen smiled for the first time since the meeting began. "Mrs. Blackwood, we investigate the investigators. If Richard Richardson has been using illegal surveillance and sabotage to gather evidence against you, that could invalidate his entire case and potentially result in federal charges against him." Tom Mitchell nodded enthusiastically. "The surveillance equipment found at your ranch, the electrical sabotage, the intimidation tactics, all of that is evidence of criminal behavior that undermines Richard's credibility as a witness." "There's something else," Rebecca Chen continued. "Environmental consulting records are public documents in many cases. If Emily's assessments were as accurate as she claims, we should be able to find independent evidence supporting her conclusions." Over the next 2 hours, they developed a comprehensive strategy for fighting Richard's accusations. Emily would provide detailed documentation of her consulting methodology. Jake would cooperate fully with financial record requests to demonstrate the timeline of their relationship, and their legal team would investigate Richard's own business practices for evidence of illegal activity. As they prepared to leave Tom's office, Rebecca Chen pulled Emily aside for a private conversation. "Mrs. Blackwood, I need to ask you something confidential," Rebecca said quietly. "Is there any possibility that your great-aunt's will contains information that Richard doesn't want made public? Any reason beyond simple greed that he might be so desperate to prevent you from claiming your inheritance?" Emily was quiet for a long moment, thinking carefully about the question. "Ms. Chen, my great-aunt was involved in environmental activism for decades. She funded research into the health effects of mining operations, and she was particularly concerned about the long-term environmental damage from strip mining. Do you think she might have documented evidence of environmental violations or cover-ups?" "It's impossible. Margaret Richardson was meticulous about record-keeping, and she had access to internal company documents through her stock ownership. If there were environmental crimes or regulatory violations, she would have kept detailed records." Rebecca Chen's eyes lit up with interest. "Mrs. Blackwood, that could change everything. If your inheritance includes evidence of environmental crimes committed by companies Richard is associated with, his desperate efforts to prevent you from claiming it make perfect sense." As Jake and Emily drove home from their legal consultation, both of them were quiet, processing the implications of what they had learned. The stakes of their marriage had escalated far beyond money or property. They were now fighting for Emily's freedom and potentially for the exposure of environmental crimes that had been covered up for decades. "Jake," Emily said as they turned into their driveway, "I need to tell you something. When I was researching your ranch before making my proposal, I found something interesting in the county records." Jake glanced at her, noting the tension in her voice. "What kind of something?" "Richardson Mining Corporation applied for exploratory drilling permits on property adjacent to your ranch 3 years ago. The permits were denied based on environmental concerns, but the application included geological surveys of this entire area. The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. "Emily, are you saying that my ranch sits on potential mining deposits?" "I'm saying that's a possibility. And if Richard Richardson gets control of the mining company, he'll have the resources to reapply for those permits and potentially force you to sell through eminent domain claims." Jake pulled the truck to a stop in front of their house and turned to face Emily directly. "So this isn't just about your inheritance. Richard sees my ranch as an obstacle to a potentially massive mining operation." "Exactly. Jake, I think we've been thinking too small about what Richard is after. This isn't just about family money. This is about controlling millions of dollars in mineral rights and removing any obstacles to extracting them." As they sat in the truck processing this revelation, Jake felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of their situation. Emily hadn't just chosen him randomly for a marriage of convenience. She had chosen him because their interests were aligned in ways that went far beyond business arrangements. "Emily," Jake said quietly, "I think we need to consider the possibility that your great-aunt chose her inheritance conditions very carefully. Maybe she knew about Richard's mining plans, and maybe she structured the will to ensure that someone with environmental values would be in a position to stop him." Emily turned to face Jake, her green eyes wide with realization. "Jake, what if this entire situation, my inheritance deadline, the marriage requirement, even Richard's desperate response, what if it was all planned by my great-aunt as a way to protect both the environment and people like you who would be harmed by strip mining?" As the sun set over the Blackwood Ranch, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Jake and Emily began to understand that their marriage of convenience had become something far more significant than either of them had anticipated. They weren't just fighting for money or property, they were fighting to preserve a way of life and protect the environment for future generations. The battle with Richard Richardson was about to become a war for the soul of the American West, and Jake Blackwood was discovering that he was prepared to fight it not just as Emily's husband, but as a guardian of everything he held sacred about the land his family had called home for over a century. 2 weeks after the FBI visit, Emily stood in the dusty attic of Margaret Richardson's Victorian mansion in Denver, surrounded by decades of carefully preserved documents that could either save their lives or destroy them completely. The executor of her great-aunt's estate had finally granted access to the personal papers, and what Emily was discovering exceeded her wildest expectations. "Jake, you need to see this," Emily called down through the attic access, her voice tight with excitement and apprehension. She held a leather-bound journal dated 1987, filled with Margaret Richardson's meticulous handwriting, documenting what appeared to be systematic environmental cover-ups by Richardson Mining Corporation. Jake climbed the narrow stairs into the cramped attic space, noting how Emily had organized dozens of file boxes with the methodical precision she brought to everything. Sunlight filtered through a small window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits bearing witness to secrets that had been hidden for decades. "What did you find?" Jake asked, settling beside Emily on the wooden floor. As she opened the journal to a page marked with a faded ribbon, Emily's finger traced her great-aunt's elegant script as she read aloud. "Today, I received confirmation that the Copper Creek watershed contamination was not accidental, as Richard has claimed to federal regulators. Internal company memos clearly show that management knew about the faulty containment systems 6 months before the spill occurred. They chose to continue operations rather than shut down for repairs because the Christmas bonus structure was tied to fourth-quarter production numbers." Jake felt his blood run cold. "Emily, Copper Creek runs right through my ranch. We've been drinking that water, using it for the cattle irrigation, everything." Emily turned several pages in the journal, revealing photographs of dead fish, contaminated soil samples, and what appeared to be internal Richardson mining documents. "Jake, according to this, the contamination was far worse than what was reported." Publicly, Margaret documented everything: water test results, internal emails, even recordings of phone conversations where company officials discussed covering up the extent of the damage. The implications were staggering. If Margaret Richardson's documentation was accurate, Richardson Mining Corporation had committed environmental crimes that resulted in widespread contamination of the very land Jake's family had been working for generations. "There's more," Emily said, opening another file box that contained medical records and health studies. Margaret funded an independent health study of families living downstream from the mining operations. The results showed elevated cancer rates, birth defects, and neurological problems that were never reported to health authorities. Jake studied the medical documentation with growing horror and rage. His own father had died of lung cancer at 58, an early death that the family had attributed to years of smoking and hard physical labor. Now he was looking at evidence suggesting that environmental contamination might have been a contributing factor. "Emily, if this information is accurate, why didn't your great-aunt go public with it? Why hide it away in an attic instead of exposing these crimes?" Emily was quiet for several minutes, reading through more of Margaret's journals. According to this, she tried. She approached federal regulators, environmental groups, even journalists. But Richard had political connections and enough money to discredit her evidence and silence potential witnesses. She held up a manila folder containing what appeared to be legal documents. Margaret spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on attorneys and private investigators, but every time she got close to exposing the truth, key witnesses would recant their testimony or crucial evidence would mysteriously disappear. Jake examined the legal documents, noting names of attorneys, government officials, and mining industry executives that painted a picture of systematic corruption. So she decided to wait for the right opportunity to ensure this information reached someone who could actually use it effectively. Exactly. And Jake, I think that's why she structured the inheritance the way she did. She needed someone who understood environmental issues but wasn't part of the existing power structure, someone who couldn't be bought off or intimidated into silence. Emily pulled out another file that contained geological surveys and mining permits. Look at this. Richardson Mining has been systematically acquiring mineral rights throughout this region for decades, using shell companies and intermediaries to hide the scope of their operations. Jake studied the maps and documents, recognizing property descriptions that included not just his own ranch, but dozens of neighboring operations. Emily, they're planning to strip mine this entire valley. The Blackwood Ranch isn't just one target. It's part of a massive operation that would destroy thousands of acres of agricultural land. The sound of footsteps on the stairs below interrupted the conversation. Emily's face went pale as she realized they might not be alone in the house. "Mrs. Blackwood, are you up there?" The voice belonged to Harold Wessler, Margaret Richardson's longtime attorney and the executor of her estate. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have visitors who insist on speaking with you immediately." Emily and Jake exchanged worried glances before Emily called down, "What kind of visitors, Mr. Wessler?" "Federal agents, ma'am. They have a search warrant for Mrs. Richardson's personal papers and property." Jake's mind raced as he looked around the attic filled with potentially explosive evidence. "Emily, we need to decide right now what we're going to do with this information. If the FBI confiscates it as part of their investigation into you, Richard's people might be able to suppress it again." Emily was already moving, gathering the most crucial documents and photographs into a single file box. "Jake, take this box. Down to your truck. Use the back stairs and go out through the kitchen. I'll deal with the federal agents and try to buy you time." "Emily, I'm not leaving you here alone to face federal agents. Jake, one of us needs to get this evidence to safety. If both of us are arrested, this information disappears forever." Emily's voice was firm with resolve. "Take it to Rebecca Chen. She'll know how to use it properly." Jake reluctantly took the file box, noting its substantial weight as Emily selected additional documents with rapid precision. "Emily, what are you going to tell them about what we found up here? The truth that we're researching my great-aunt's papers as part of settling her estate. I won't lie to federal agents, but I also won't volunteer information they don't specifically ask for." As Jake made his way down the back stairs with the box of evidence, he could hear voices in the front of the house, official, authoritative tones that suggested the federal agents were not in a mood for delay or diplomacy. He loaded the box into his pickup truck and waited anxiously for Emily to emerge from what was essentially a federal interrogation. 20 minutes later, Emily appeared at the back door of the mansion, escorted by two serious-looking agents who watched as she approached Jake's truck. "Mr. Blackwood," one of the agents called out, "we'll need you to stay available for additional questions as our investigation continues." Jake nodded acknowledgement while noting that Emily's face was carefully composed but tense. They drove away from the mansion in silence, both of them processing the magnitude of what they had discovered and the implications for their legal situation. "What did they want to know?" Jake asked as they merged onto the highway back toward Montana. "Everything. How long I'd been in the attic, what I was looking for, whether I'd found anything relevant to their investigation." Emily's voice was steady, but Jake could hear the stress underneath. They confiscated several boxes of documents, but fortunately, most of the environmental evidence was in the box you took. Jake glanced at the file box in the back seat of his truck. Emily, what we found up there, it changes everything, doesn't it? This isn't just about inheritance fraud or marriage arrangements. This is about exposing environmental crimes that could send Richard and his associates to federal prison for decades. That's exactly right. And Jake, I think that's why Richard is so desperate to prevent me from claiming the inheritance. It's not just about the money. It's about preventing this evidence from ever seeing the light of day. As they drove through the Montana landscape toward home, Emily's cell phone rang. The caller ID showed Rebecca Chen, their federal defense attorney, and Emily answered with a sense of urgency. Emily, thank God I reached you. Rebecca's voice was tight with concern. I just received a call from the prosecutor's office in Denver. They're expediting the investigation and planning to seek indictments within the next 2 weeks. Emily's face went pale. Rebecca, we found something today that could change everything. Evidence of environmental crimes committed by Richardson. Mining that explains why Richard is so desperate to stop us. Emily, listen to me carefully. Do not discuss any evidence over the phone. Assume that all your communications are being monitored. Can you and Jake meet me in Billings tomorrow morning? We'll be there, Emily replied, though Jake could see the strain in her face as she contemplated the rapid escalation of their legal jeopardy. As they ended the call, Jake felt a strange sense of clarity about their situation. Emily, we're not running anymore. We're fighting back. Emily turned to look at Jake, noting the determination in his voice. Jake, you understand what this means, don't you? If we expose this evidence, we're not just fighting Richard Richardson. We're taking on an entire network of political and business interests that have been covering up environmental crimes for decades. Then that's what we do, Jake replied without hesitation. Emily, my family has been working this land for over a century. My father died young, possibly because of contamination these people covered up. I'm not going to let them destroy what's left just to protect their profits. That evening, as they sat in Rebecca Chen's law office in Billings, reviewing the evidence Emily and Jake had discovered, the full scope of the conspiracy began to emerge. Margaret Richardson's documentation revealed a pattern of environmental crimes, regulatory corruption, and systematic intimidation that spanned decades and involved dozens of officials at multiple levels of government. This is extraordinary, Rebecca said, examining photographs and internal documents that clearly showed deliberate contamination and cover-ups. Emily, this evidence doesn't just exonerate you from Richard's allegations, it provides grounds for federal prosecution of Richardson Mining and potentially dozens of co-conspirators. Tom Mitchell, who had driven over from Copper Creek for the meeting, studied the geological surveys with growing amazement. Rebecca, if this documentation is accurate, Richardson Mining has been systematically poisoning agricultural communities throughout the region while bribing officials to hide the evidence. The question is, how do we use this information to protect Emily and Jake while ensuring that justice is served? Rebecca consulted her legal notes. The prosecutor handling Emily's case needs to see this evidence, but we have to be careful about how we present it. Emily leaned forward in her chair. Rebecca, what if we're thinking about this wrong? What if instead of trying to defend against Richard's accusations, we go on the offense and expose the real crimes? Rebecca smiled with the satisfaction of an attorney who had just seen the path to victory. Emily, I think you're exactly right. We file a federal whistleblower complaint documenting the environmental crimes, and we provide this evidence to environmental prosecutors rather than the white-collar crime division. Will that protect us from the fraud charges? Jake asked. "More than protect you, it will make Richard's accusations look like desperate attempts to silence witnesses to environmental crimes. Federal prosecutors hate being used as weapons in personal vendettas, especially when the real criminals are the people making the accusations." As the meeting concluded, Rebecca outlined a strategy that would transform Emily and Jake from defendants into protected witnesses in what could become one of the largest environmental prosecution cases in federal history. "There's one more thing," Rebecca said as they prepared to leave. "Emily, your great-aunt's will includes a provision that I think we've overlooked. If you successfully claim the inheritance, you're required to establish an environmental foundation dedicated to protecting agricultural communities from mining contamination." Emily's eyes widened with understanding. "Rebecca, Margaret didn't just leave me money and property. She left me a mission. She wanted me to use the inheritance to continue the fight she couldn't finish." As Jake and Emily drove home through the Montana darkness, both of them understood that their marriage of convenience had become something far more significant than either of them had ever imagined. They weren't just fighting for their own freedom, they were fighting to expose crimes that had harmed countless innocent people and to prevent future environmental destruction. The battle with Richard Richardson was about to become a war for environmental justice, and Jake Blackwood was discovering that his wife wasn't just a brilliant consultant, she was a warrior for causes that mattered more than money or personal safety. Their fake marriage was becoming real in every way that counted, forged in the crucible of shared danger and common purpose that would either destroy them or make them stronger than either could have been alone. 6 months after their courthouse wedding, Jake Blackwood stood before a packed federal courtroom in Denver, his hand resting protectively on Emily's shoulder as she prepared to testify in what had become the largest environmental prosecution case in Colorado history. The woman beside him bore little resemblance to the desperate consultant who had proposed marriage to save her inheritance. Emily Blackwood had transformed into a formidable witness whose testimony would determine the fate of dozens of defendants. Judge Maria Santos called the court to order, her stern gaze sweeping over a courtroom filled with journalists, environmental activists, mining industry representatives, and community members whose lives had been devastated by decades of contamination. In the defendants section, Richard Richardson sat with his team of expensive attorneys, his once confident demeanor replaced by the hollow stare of a man watching his empire crumble. "Mrs. Blackwood," Prosecutor James Harrison began, "please, tell the court how you became aware of the systematic environmental crimes committed by Richardson Mining Corporation." Emily's voice was clear and unwavering as she recounted their discovery of Margaret Richardson's hidden documentation, the surveillance and sabotage they had endured, and the pattern of corruption that had protected environmental criminals for decades. Jake watched the jury's faces as Emily spoke, noting the growing horror and anger as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. "Mrs. Blackwood, you mentioned that your husband's ranch was directly affected by these crimes. Can you explain how?" Emily turned slightly to look at Jake, and in her eyes he saw not just professional respect, but genuine love, the kind that had grown from shared danger, common purpose, and mutual admiration. "Your Honor, my husband's family has worked the same land for over 130 years. They trusted that the water they drank, the soil they farmed, and the air they breathed were safe because government agencies were supposed to protect them from contamination." She paused, consulting her notes before continuing. "Instead, those agencies were corrupted by mining interests who valued profits over human lives. Jake's father died of cancer at 58, and we now know that Richardson Mining deliberately contaminated the watershed that supplied his ranch while bribing officials to hide the evidence. The courtroom erupted in murmurs of outrage before Judge Santos called for order. Jake felt a surge of pride watching Emily command the room with a combination of scientific expertise and moral authority. This was the woman he had fallen in love with, not the desperate stranger who had proposed a marriage of convenience, but the fierce advocate who fought for justice regardless of personal cost. Richard Richardson's lead attorney, the same Robert Crawford, who had orchestrated the sabotage at their ranch, approached Emily for cross-examination with obvious reluctance. The illegal surveillance and intimidation campaign had backfired spectacularly, providing prosecutors with evidence of obstruction of justice that had added years to the potential sentences. "Mrs. Blackwood," Crawford began, his voice lacking, its usual confidence, "isn't it true that you married Jake Blackwood solely to claim an inheritance worth millions of dollars?" Emily met Crawford's gaze steadily. "Mr. Crawford, I married Jake Blackwood because he's a man of integrity who shares my values and my commitment to protecting the environment. The inheritance allowed us to build something meaningful together, but it was never the foundation of our relationship. But you admit that financial considerations played a role in your decision to marry." "Financial considerations played a role in the timing of our marriage," Emily replied without hesitation. "But love and respect determined our decision to build a life together. Mr. Crawford, surely you understand the difference between practical considerations and genuine partnership." Jake smiled at Emily's response, noting how she had turned Crawford's attack into an affirmation of their relationship. Over the past 6 months, their marriage of convenience had indeed become a genuine partnership built on shared goals, mutual respect and growing affection that had surprised them both. The prosecution's case unfolded over 3 weeks, revealing a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of state and federal government. Richardson Mining had systematically bribed regulatory officials, falsified environmental impact studies, and intimidated witnesses to hide contamination that had affected over 50,000 people across 4 states. Margaret Richardson's meticulously preserved documentation proved to be the key evidence that broke the case wide open. Her journals, photographs, and recordings provided a roadmap of criminal activity that prosecutors used to flip lower-level conspirators and build cases against the senior executives. On the day of Richard Richardson's testimony, Jake watched from the gallery as Emily's cousin took the stand, with the arrogance of someone who still believed money and connections could save him from justice. Richard's testimony was a masterclass in self-incrimination, as he alternated between denying knowledge of environmental crimes and blaming subordinates for decisions that the evidence clearly showed he had directed personally. "Mr. Richardson," Prosecutor Harrison asked during a particularly devastating line of questioning, "when you authorized the surveillance and sabotage of your cousin's ranch, were you attempting to prevent her from accessing evidence of your environmental crimes?" Richard's attorney objected, but the damage was done. Richard's face had flushed red with anger, and his carefully rehearsed composure cracked completely. "She had no right to that inheritance," Richard shouted, ignoring his attorney's frantic gestures to remain quiet. Margaret was a senile old woman who didn't understand business realities. Emily's environmental extremism would have destroyed thousands of jobs and billions in economic development. "Mr. Richardson, did you order your associates to plant surveillance devices in the Blackwood ranch house?" "We were gathering evidence of fraud. Emily's marriage was a sham designed to steal money that rightfully belonged to—" "Your Honor, I object," Richard's attorney interrupted desperately, but it was too late. Richard had essentially confessed to multiple federal crimes on the witness stand. Judge Santos's verdict, delivered 2 weeks later, was swift and comprehensive. Richard Richardson was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for environmental crimes, conspiracy, racketeering, and obstruction of justice. Robert Crawford received 15 years for his role in the surveillance and sabotage campaign. Dozens of other defendants, including state regulators and mining company executives, received sentences ranging from 5 to 20 years. But the legal victory was only the beginning of Jake and Emily's real mission. Using the inheritance Emily had successfully claimed, they established the Margaret Richardson Environmental Foundation, dedicated to protecting agricultural communities from mining contamination and supporting families affected by environmental crimes. The foundation's first major project was the comprehensive cleanup of the Copper Creek watershed, a $50 million effort that would restore the water quality that Jake's family had depended on for generations. Environmental engineers worked with local ranchers to implement sustainable practices that would prevent future contamination while preserving the agricultural heritage of the region. A year after the trial's conclusion, Jake stood on the front porch of the restored Blackwood Ranch house, watching Emily work with a group of environmental science students who were conducting water quality monitoring as part of the foundation's ongoing research. The woman who had once proposed marriage to a stranger had become his true partner in every sense: professional collaborator, environmental advocate, and the love of his life. "Jake, come look at this," Emily called from near the creek that ran through their property. She held up a water quality testing kit that showed results dramatically improved from the contaminated readings they had discovered during the trial preparation. Jake walked over to where Emily stood with the students, noting how naturally she had assumed the role of teacher and mentor. The Foundation's education programs brought hundreds of young people to the ranch each year, learning about environmental science while gaining hands-on experience with sustainable agriculture. The nitrate levels are down 60% from last year, Emily explained to the students, and the heavy metal contamination that resulted from mining runoff has been reduced to below detection limits. One of the students, a young woman named Sarah, who reminded Jake of Emily at that age, raised her hand. "Mrs. Blackwood, how long will it take for the ecosystem to fully recover?" Emily smiled, and Jake saw in her expression the same passion for environmental protection that had driven her great-aunt's decades-long fight against corruption. "Sarah, ecosystem recovery is measured in generations, not years. The work we're doing today will benefit your children and your children's children." As the afternoon wore on and the students departed for their dormitories in town, Jake and Emily found themselves alone on their porch, watching the sunset paint the restored landscape in shades of gold and crimson. The Blackwood Ranch had not just survived. It had become a model for sustainable agriculture and environmental stewardship that attracted visitors from around the world. "Emily, do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't walked into my life that morning?" Jake asked, settling into the rocking chair beside his wife. Emily reached over and took his hand, her wedding ring catching the last rays of sunlight. "Jake, I don't think it was chance. I think Margaret orchestrated everything. The inheritance, conditions, the marriage requirement, even the timing that brought us together when we both needed each other most." Jake considered this, thinking about the series of seemingly coincidental events that had transformed his desperate situation into the foundation for a life more meaningful than anything he had ever imagined. "So, you think your great-aunt was playing matchmaker from beyond the grave? I think she understood that the best partnerships are built on shared values and common purpose," Emily replied. "The love came naturally once we discovered what we could accomplish together." As if summoned by their conversation, Sarah Martinez's pickup truck appeared on the gravel drive, followed by several other vehicles filled with community members. Jake recognized most of the faces, neighbors, business owners, and friends who had supported them throughout their legal battles and environmental restoration efforts. "Surprise!" Sarah called out as the group approached the porch. "We thought you might want some company for your first wedding anniversary." Jake and Emily exchanged amused glances. In the chaos of trials, foundation work, and ranch restoration, they had completely forgotten that today marked exactly 1 year since their courthouse wedding. "Sarah, you didn't need to—" Emily began, but she was interrupted by Tom Mitchell's appearance with a cooler of beer and what appeared to be a homemade cake. "Emily, this community owes you and Jake a debt we can never fully repay," Tom said, as the group settled onto the porch and surrounding yard. "You didn't just save one ranch. You exposed crimes that were affecting all of us and our families." Sheriff Davidson, who had become a close friend during the investigation and trial, raised his beer bottle in a toast. To Jake and Emily Blackwood, who proved that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships produce the most extraordinary results. As the impromptu anniversary celebration continued into the evening, Jake found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. A year ago, he had been a desperate man, facing the loss of everything his family had built. Tonight, he was surrounded by friends and community members who respected what he and Emily had accomplished together. "Jake, penny for your thoughts," Emily said quietly, joining him at the porch railing as their guests continued talking and laughing nearby. "I was thinking about that first morning when you proposed marriage to a complete stranger," Jake replied. "Did you have any idea what we were getting ourselves into?" Emily laughed, the sound filled with genuine happiness. "Jake, I thought I was making a simple business arrangement to claim an inheritance. I had no idea I was proposing to my future best friend, business partner, and the love of my life." Jake turned to face Emily directly, noting how the evening light softened her features and highlighted the contentment in her green eyes. "Emily Blackwood, would you marry me?" Emily looked confused for a moment before understanding dawned on her face. "Jake Blackwood, are you proposing to your own wife?" "I'm proposing to the woman I fell in love with, asking her to choose our marriage again, but this time for all the right reasons." Emily's eyes filled with tears of joy as she understood what Jake was offering. A chance to transform their legal arrangement into a genuine commitment based on love rather than necessity. "Yes," Emily said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you again, Jake Blackwood, for love, for partnership, for the family we're building together, and for all the adventures still to come." As Jake kissed his wife under the Montana stars, surrounded by friends who had become family and working land that would be preserved for future generations, he understood that sometimes the most desperate moments lead to the most beautiful beginnings. Their marriage of convenience had become a love story. Their environmental battle had become a victory for justice. And their struggle to save one ranch had become a mission to protect the land and water that sustained entire communities. The Blackwood Ranch would continue for another generation, but now it carried a new legacy, proof that when good people stand together against corruption and greed, they can create something beautiful and lasting that benefits everyone who comes after them. In the distance, Thunder and the other horses moved peacefully through restored pastures, drinking clean water under unpolluted skies, living symbols of what could be accomplished when love, determination, and environmental stewardship combined to heal both the land and the people who called it home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.